Wow. Okay, so we're diving into Israeli real estate today, and let me tell you, these articles, seriously eye-opening stuff.
Yeah, it's a hot topic for sure. A lot to unpack.
No kidding. Like, one thing that really hit me, the whole affordability thing, it's like everywhere you look, right?
Yeah.
Young people struggling to buy, prices going crazy.
Right. And it's not just about prices, is it? You've got interest rates going up, 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 and then construction costs.
Oh, don't even get me started on construction costs.
It's a perfect storm. And of course, inflation just makes everything worse. We really see all those factors impacting the bigger picture. The
Or Grenade.
Okay, yeah. So for anyone who isn't fluent in Hebrew like myself, essentially translates to the state of real estate in Israel. And right now I'm kind of getting the vibe that the state is, well, maybe turbulent is the word. Turbulent is a good word. It really is a complex picture. It's not just, oh, our price is up this month or down. It's about understanding all these underlying forces, how they impact whether someone can even afford to buy a place, whether it makes sense to invest.
And let's be real, it even affects the social fabric, right?
Yeah.
Like, if young people can't afford to live in a city, it changes the whole vibe.
Yeah.
Several articles really honed in on that, this idea of home ownership as a dream deferred for many Israelis right now.
It's a huge concern. And a lot of it comes back to those factors we talked about at the beginning. Interest rates being high means mortgages are more expensive.
So even if you can swing the down payment,
Exactly. Then you've got to keep up with those monthly payments. And with construction costs so high, there's not enough new housing to meet the demand.
which I imagine is especially intense in those super desirable areas. You think Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, places people want to be?
Absolutely. Limited land, huge demand. It's a classic recipe for sky-high prices.
Okay, so we've got this picture of the market forces at play, especially as they relate to the current cretoire. But before we even think about investment strategies, we've got to talk about the elephant in the room when it comes to real estate taxes. From what I'm seeing, the Israeli tax system doesn't play around.
Let's just say they're definitely a factor to consider.
One term that popped up over and over, purchase tax. Sounds kind of ominous, right?
It can be. It's something everyone buying property in Israel needs to be aware of.
So break it down for us. What is it in the simplest terms?
Okay, so basically it's like a tax you pay when you buy property on top of the purchase price. In Hebrew.
So not an annual property tax, but a one-time hit when you buy.
Exactly. Think of it as the government's way of getting their cut when you make a real estate deal.
And from the looks of it, that cut can be pretty hefty. Some of the articles mentioned it could be as high as 10% in certain cases.
It can be, yeah. And to make it even more fun, the exact percentage depends on a bunch of different factors, like how much the property is worth.
So a tiny studio apartment versus a luxury villa, big difference.
Big difference. And also whether it's going to be your main home or an investment property.
Got it. So someone buying their first small apartment to actually live in, they'd likely pay a lower rate than, say, an investor buying a penthouse to rent out.
Exactly. It's designed to be somewhat progressive, at least in theory. Higher earners, people buying second homes, they'll usually pay a bigger chunk of purchase tax.
That makes sense. But still, I bet it catches people off guard, this whole purchase tax thing. Especially if they aren't super familiar with all the ins and outs of Israeli real estate law.
You're telling me it's definitely one of those things where having a good lawyer, a tax professional who really knows the Israeli system, can make a huge difference.
Seriously. I mean, imagine thinking you've budgeted perfectly and then bam, this whole other tax
Yeah,
gets added on top.
it definitely pays to be prepared. And
Mm.
speaking of taxes, you've got to think about down the line. There's another one that came up a lot in these articles, capital gains.
Oh yeah, that one rings a bell. Remind me again how that works exactly.
So, capital gains tax is all about what happens when you sell a property. It's the tax you pay on the profit you make from the sale.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, I buy an apartment for, I don't know, 1.5 million shekels. A few years later, I sell it for, say, 2.5 million. I'd owe capital gains tax on that 1 million shekel profit.
You got it. Though, of course, the actual amount you'd owe, it's complicated. It's Israel. The rate depends on a whole bunch of factors, like how long you own the property.
So if I held onto that apartment for 20 years versus 2 years, that would make a difference.
Exactly. And whether you lived in it as your primary residence or rented it out, that can impact things too.
Starting to feel like I need a PhD in Israeli tax law just to buy an apartment.
Well, a good accountant certainly helps, but, all jokes aside, even with these complexities, even with the taxes being, well, what they are, There's still a lot of interest in Israeli real estate. There are some real advantages that keep drawing people in, especially in the current economic climate, when we're thinking about the current Blahat and what that means for people.
Yeah, and that's what really struck me when I was reading through everything. Despite all the challenges, a lot of these articles were actually pretty optimistic about investing in Israeli real estate.
Exactly. It's not all doom and gloom. There are some solid reasons why people see it as a good long-term investment, even in a market as, let's say, dynamic as Israel's.
Well, you've got me intrigued. So spill the beans. What are the key advantages? What makes Israeli real estate stand out, even with everything else going on? Why invest, especially now, considering the current? What's the upside? Well, you've got me intrigued, so spill the beans. What are the key advantages? What makes Israeli real estate stand out, even with everything else going on? Why invest, especially now, considering the current cath? What's the upside?
Well, one thing that stands out is the historical track record. I mean, it's pretty impressive, right? Israeli real estate has a way of weathering the storms, economically speaking.
You mean even when things are going haywire globally, prices in Israel tend to?
They tend to hold their own, often even go up over the long term.
That's pretty remarkable when you think about how unpredictable everything seems these days. What is it about Israeli real estate that makes it so resilient?
It's a few things. Partly, it's that basic supply and demand principle. Israel, geographically, it's a small country.
Right, and with a growing population.
Exactly. More people, limited land, especially in the areas people want to live, like those city centers we were talking about. That creates a sort of built-in demand. And that demand helps keep those property values up.
So even if there are ups and downs in the market, that baseline demand acts as a sort of safety net.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's that whole inflation hedge we touched on earlier. Real estate has this reputation, in many places, but definitely in Israel, as being a good way to protect your money from inflation.
Because as everything else gets more expensive, theoretically so does the value of your property.
Right. Of course, no investment is without risk, and that definitely applies to Israeli real estate, too.
That's what I was waiting for. I mean, it can't all be sunshine and roses, right? What about the downsides? What are some of the risks people need to be aware of, especially with the whole class thing?
Well, as we've been discussing, the market is influenced by a ton of factors, some within Israel, some global. You could have some geopolitical event, some new regulation, even interest rate hikes by, say, the Fed in the U.S. All those things can have ripple effects on investor confidence, which ultimately trickles down to property values.
So it's not a passive investment. You can't just buy and forget about it. You really need to stay on top of things.
Exactly. Due diligence is absolutely crucial. Doing your research, really understanding the market, the legal side, the tax implications, and working with professionals who know their stuff, that's all super important.
Speaking of professionals, I imagine that's especially key with those less conventional investment strategies we talked about earlier, like those basement conversions.
Oh, yeah. That's not a DIY kind of project. You need a good team behind you. Lawyers, contractors, tax advisors, people who can make sure everything is done by the book and who can help you maximize your chances of success.
It sounds like with Israeli real estate, and especially with the choice strat as it is, it's all about finding a balance. Right?
Yeah.
Being aware of the potential rewards, but also going in with your eyes wide open about the risks.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, as they say. And nowhere is that truer than in real estate. The more informed you are, the better decisions you'll make. And those decisions should always align with your own personal financial goals and your own risk tolerance.
Man, that is some sage advice. I am feeling much more informed already. And speaking of knowledge, we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive, from the overall economic forces shaping the Tetrayon to the very practicalities of taxes, and even those intriguing but potentially complicated basement conversions. As we wrap up, is there one final thought you'd leave with our listener, something for them to chew on as they continue their own real estate journeys?
Here's a question to ponder, especially given everything we've talked about today. Does owning a piece of the Israeli dream, having that tangible connection to this land, does that outweigh the potential challenges of navigating the current process?
Wow. Now that's a question. And, it really gets to the heart of why Israeli real estate is so compelling. It's more than just bricks and mortar, right? It's an emotional investment as much as a financial one.
Exactly. And finding that sweet spot where financial strategy and that deeper connection to the land intersect, that's where the magic happens.
Well said. This deep dive has given me so much to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of Israeli real estate, a market that never ceases to surprise and intrigue.